So, Be'ezus Hashem, we're looking at another Midah in the discovery of the Sefiros and looking every week, building closer towards Shavuot, Man Matan Torah Seinu, where we can truly be Mekabel the Torah with a full heart, with a full mind, as an Am together in Eretz Yisrael, Be'ezus Hashem. But until then, we can take each step one day at a time, building ourselves to be the fullest people that we can be, become the B'nai Chorin that are meant to be Mekabel the Torah. And today, for the purpose of those explorations, we're looking at the Midah of Netzach, ShebeYesod. So we've seen the concept of Netzach repeatedly throughout we spent an entire week looking at the concept of Netzach, the eternality, the fight, success, victory, all of these ideas that are sort of connected together, an eternal victory. And today we're looking at how that aspect, that Midah, is a component of the Midah of Yesod. So we've already been looking at the concept of Yesod through the identity that's described in the Zohar as being the Tzaddik, is the name of the Midah of Yesod, the Tzaddik Yesod Olam, the pillar of the world, a person who is committed to the Vayehi Or, of being Megala, that Or in the world, who lives with integrity to the purpose of Ma'aseh Bereishis, a person who chooses a resounding V'charta B'chaim, a person who has ne'emanus to the vision that Hashem has for the world, and strives to live in consonance with that idea, with integrity and with faith. And so if we're looking at the idea of Netzach, of eternal, victorious value, a lot of different aspects of Netzach to kind of describe through the single expression, through the Midah of Yesod. I think that one of the places where this comes out is the idea of how when a person is embodying Yesod and living with that level of integrity and acting as a channel for Hashem's Or in the world, what ends up happening is that there's a certain degree of bitul hayesh, of kind of the erasure of individual selfhood in the presence of being the channel for that value that you represent. And one of the places where this comes out is, I believe, is the idea how, as the Rambam describes in Hilchos Malachim, the whole notion of fighting on behalf of Am Yisrael. To stand up and fight in the Milchemes Hashem for the sake of the Jewish people, and specifically to be actually part of the army of the Tzva Hashem, in fighting the wars for the Jewish people, we find this idea that the only people who were really allowed in status into fighting the war for Hashem, actually being members of the army of the Jewish people, are people who are tzaddikim, as Rashi brings in Chumash. But beyond that, the Rambam describes, if you haven't seen this description before, it might blow your mind. And even if you have seen it, it's startling every time to revisit the Lashon over here. In the 7th chapter of Hilchos Malachim, Bruchim Abayim, Reb Simcha. So the ideas over here are really profound, the Rambam says. How does a member of Yisrael go out to battle for the sake of the Jewish people? So the Rambam's language is really startling. And he starts off by playing off the pasuk where it says, Mi ha'isha yareh v'rach halevav. Who is the person who's afraid, who's soft-hearted? We tell them to go home before battle. And Rambam says this means that a person whose heart doesn't have the capacity to withstand the difficulties of the conflict of war. And because the Rambam goes on to explain that once a person is out there fighting on the battlefront for the sake of Yisrael, once a person is out there in the toughs of war, they must lean entirely on the hope of Israel, and they will be saved in a time of conflict. And he has to know that he's fighting for the Yichud Hashem. He must place his soul in his hands. You can't be afraid. You can't tremble. He can't think about his wife, can't think about his children. He has to erase their memory from his heart. And turn away from everything else aside for the war itself. The war effort must become the single focus of his life. And not only that, but says the Rambam, this is not some sort of abstract ideal, but kol hamatchil lachshov ulahar b'milchama, anyone who even begins to start thinking and contemplating during war about his personal endeavors, umavhil atzmo, and distracts himself, over b'lo taseh, he's violating in lo taseh in the Torah. Shneamar al yirach levavchem. Not only that, he says, v'lo od ela shekol dmei Yisrael teluyin b'tzavaro, all of the blood of Israel is hanging on his neck, so to speak. In other words, you're responsible for all the bloodshed that occurs amongst the Jewish people because of that person's diversion from the goal, from the focus, from the orientation that a member of the Tzva Yisrael has to have, from fighting for Yichud Hashem, fighting for the sake of Yisrael, only purpose of being to fight for that war, for the nitzachon. And he says, "Ve'im lo nitzach v'lo asal milchama b'chol libo v'chol nafsho." And if you're unsuccessful and unable to fight that fight with your entire heart and your entire soul, harei zeh kimisha shafach demei hakol. It's like you murdered the entire Jewish people. Shneamar v'lo yimasad levav echad ki levavo. So this is incredibly powerful language. But he goes and he closes on a more positive note, and he says that anyone who does fight with their entire heart, without any fear, and his direction of his heart is to sanctify God's name singularly, that is his sole focus, it is guaranteed to him that he will not find any harm, and no evil will befall him. And he will build a steady home in the Jewish people, and he will merit for himself and his children all eternity. So we see this very fascinating juxtaposition of ideas right here in the Rambam's presentation. We have the idea where a person acts entirely selflessly for the sake of the larger picture, for the sake of the value that he represents. He desires to purely be a channel for Hashem's or in the world, so to speak, if you're utilizing this language of Yesod, that he's making himself to be the pillar of the Jewish people. All the Jewish people are dependent on him. What does that echo in our minds? All of the Jewish people, the entire world, is dependent on this person. And if he goes out and if he's minatseach, says the Rambam, if he has nitzachon doing this, then without question, Hashem says, he's going to have eternal victory in his family. Him, his children, his grandchildren, and he'll be zocha to chaye nitzachon in olam haba. What's the idea going on over here? That when a person takes upon themselves the mantle of the Midah of Yesod and he steps into the identity of a tzaddik Yesod Olam, part of that demands that he doesn't think about himself personally, what this means for me, for my family, for my place in the Jewish people. But it's simply because I stand for Yisrael. And in the same way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, if a person goes out on the battlefront for the sake of Yisrael, and he stands in as that Netzach, and he allows himself to be a tool by means of which the Hanhagas Hashem can be Megala in the world, he acts as a funnel to open up that Gilui into the world. So Memela, he's Zocha to Chaye Netzach. But also it goes in both directions. By virtue of acting in Yesod, a person achieves the nitzchiot of his own life, but it's only by means of a person of Yesod standing for Netzach over anything, the values that supersede their own life, that they're zocha ultimately to the level of Yesod, and Memela, they achieve this amount of nitzachon in the individual sense, that they'll be able to build their own home, and that also they'll be zocha to chaye olam haba. So let's build this into something a little bit more concrete as well. And I want to look at a very practical aspect of the Midah of Netzach ShebeYesod, which is also an incredibly powerful lesson for life as well. I want to pivot this entire discussion on this incredible letter that we've referenced a few times of Rav Yitzchak Hutner in the collected letters that they published in the series of Pachad Yitzchak, letter 128. And he bases the entire letter on this pasuk in Mishlei that Shlomo HaMelech says, which is a relatively well-known pasuk of Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'kam, V'rashayim yikashlu b'ra'ah. That a tzaddik falls 7 times and gets back up. Whereas the Rasha, he stumbles in his own wickedness, in evil. So the context of this letter that Rav Hutner is writing, and it's worth reading in its entirety, but I just brought an excerpt from the letter here in the sources. The context of the letter is that a student of Rav Hutner is writing to him, basically pouring out his heart that he feels that he's lost all the inspiration that he had from back while he was in yeshiva. And he feels like, when he was in yeshiva, he was steiging and he was on such a high and he had this desire for greatness within him. And now that he's back home and, it's been a couple of months, he really feels that he doesn't have what he used to have to be able to achieve the things that he used to desire. So in part of this response that Rav Hutner writes to the student, he says a number of very powerful things. And he starts off by saying that there's an illness that we have as collectively, as a community. And he says, and that is that when we start discussing the greatness of our Torah scholars, of our Gedolei Hador, what we do is we always look at the final denominator, who they are now at the end of the line. And we talk about the great perfection that they've acquired, and at the same time we skip over all of the internal struggle that they had to endure within themselves. And he says that what ends up happening, the result of this is that we start perceiving Gedolim, giants, great people, by means of their final results. And we almost imagine that they came out of the womb that way. He says that everybody talks about it. He brings this example. He says everybody raises up on a banner the great, pure language of the Chavetz Chaim. But he says, who knows how many milchamot, how many struggles, how many failures, how many michsholim did he go through? How many nefilot? How many times was he thrown backwards? Nesigot la'achor. Shematzah Chavetz Chaim baderech hamilchama shalo im yitzor hara. How many can you imagine? Mashal echad mini aleph. Obviously, it's 1 in 1,000 that is successful. And he continues on and says that what you need to know, he says, is that the essence of a person's neshama, of a person's greatness, is not rooted in their Yetzer HaTov. You're not identified with who you are by means of your Yetzer HaTov, he says. Ela davka milchamto shel Yetzer HaTov. It's specifically the war that's waged that you are identified by means of. And he says a very important thing. He says, in English they say the saying, lose a battle and win the war. He quotes it in English in the middle of the essay. And he says that what this means is that what you need to know is that the pasuk says Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam. The pasuk says the tzaddik falls down 7 times, they get back up. And he says the tipshim fools think that the pasuk just means something very simple. That even though the tzaddik might stumble 7 times, lamaisa he always gets back up. But he says no. The chachamim know very well that the intention of this pasuk is Shemahus Hakima Shel Tzadik. He hasheva nefilo shalom. The essence of the getting up of the tzaddik's rising to the top, is defined by the 7 times that he fell down. And then he plays on the pasuk of Bereshis, Vayarik et kol asher asa v'hinei tov me'od. Tov is the Yetzer HaTov. Tov me'od is the Yetzer Hara. And he continues and says that what you have to understand from this is that what it means to be a tzaddik is the fact that you're a part of a relentless struggle for victory. Being a tzaddik is defined by the Netzach, which is an identifying feature of being Yesod. Because to be the tzaddik be'emunato yichtya means that if you're not plugged into that emunah, if you're not entirely connected and in an unceasing way, you are unwilling to surrender that battle. You might lose a particular battle, but you'll always win the war. What it means to be a tzaddik is that, by definition, you will go through those struggles. Because that's what it means to be a tzaddik. You're going to struggle. And he goes on and says, I beg of you, my dear Talmud, b'bakasha mimcha, al titzayer b'nafshecha gadlutam shel gedolei olam. Never imagine in your mind that the greatness of gedolim is shehem b'yitzram hatov b'bechinat chadhu. Don't think that they and their Yetzer HaTov are synonymous. He says, on the contrary, Tzier gadlucham shel gedolei olam, the way you have to depict great people in your mind is be'otiot shel milchama nora'ah, in the midst of a fierce, awesome war. Im kol hanetiot hashvelot v'nemuchot, amidst all of the most lowly and despicable drives and struggles that you could possibly imagine. That's where you imagine a tzaddik. You don't imagine a tzaddik glowing in this incredible aura of the Beis Medrash. Imagine a tzaddik with blood and guts surrounding him, dragging his way out of the depths of the mire of the gashmias of this world, and coming out victorious. Sheva yipol tzaddik v'kam. It's only because the tzaddik is willing to fall that he's ultimately zoche to that kima. And indeed, it's that, as the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, it's the makom shebali tshuva omdim. A tzaddik gomer is not able to be there. Because what the tzaddik gomer has is nothing compared to what the level of integrity that a Yosef is able to have. The tzaddik gomer isn't a ne'eman the way that Yosef was. In the Medrash we saw the other day, that Yosef is, as the Medrash Tanchuma said, that one of the three ne'emanim of the world is when you have a single guy living in a difficult district. He's living in Miami Beach, and he's out there, and he's a ne'eman. There's nothing greater than that, because ultimately he struggled. And if he struggled and committed himself to the war, he's come out on top. And what he says is just, the language is too beautiful not to share. So what Rav Hutner says is that at a time that you feel within yourself the struggle with your Yetzer, he says, Da lecha, you gotta know that it's right in that moment that you have more in common with those Gedolim that you emulate than when you're sitting in the Beis Medrash in a state of pure bliss. Davka be'otam ha'mekomot, shincha motzeh ma'atzmecha ha'yeridot ha'chi merubot. Specifically in those moments that you find yourself in the deepest struggles and the lowest points of your life, Davka be'otam ha'mekomot omed hincha lihiyot kli lihitzdayanut shel kvod shamayim. It's specifically in those moments that you find yourself available to be a receptacle for the kavod of shamayim to be megala in the world. It's in those moments that you are mitdameh el hagdolim harbe yoter me'asher b'shah shata nimtza b'menucha shlema shata rotze ba. It's in those moments that you're more similar to those gedolim than the times that you're out there in spiritual bliss. And so Memela, the Midah of Netzach ShebeYesod, tells us that the life of a tzaddik is a difficult one. Living as a funnel, as a channel, with integrity to being megala, the or of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Ma'aseh Bereishis, is one which oftentimes requires erasure of oneself, forgetting one's own family, one's own children, forgetting the local responsibilities that you have, and ultimately waging war and fighting on the front lines. And sometimes that's going to be a bloody battle, and it's going to have its losses. And there are going to be people who are lost along the sidelines, and possibly parts of ourselves that are lost along the sidelines as well. But if a person goes forth in that battle with the mentality of recognizing that it's specifically in that nefila, it's specifically in the war, in the battle zone, that they resemble most the tzaddik be'emunaso yichyeh, which is the or zarua la tzaddik. It's specifically as you're down there in the dirt, that you're planting and you're involved in the world, that you're committed to that nitzachon at all costs, come hell or high water. It's at that moment that in the Rambam's Lashon we can be misha'en al mikvah Yisrael. It's only then that we can rely and we can lean upon the hope of Yisrael, the line that we draw ourselves along, that is constantly connecting us back, the kav that brings us back to the Matzi Rishon, to the Ein Sof, that connects us back as that Yesod, as that funnel, as literally the Yesod, which is the finale of the Kava Emsa'i. A person who lives with that level of bris never loses sight of the project that they're involved in, and ultimately, as Rav Hutner closed in that line, ultimately becomes a kli to a further exposure of the Kvod Shamayim in this world. And as a result of that, they become somebody who acts on part for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And as we kind of segue our way towards Malchut, where, again, Yesod is really the way by which Malchut is expressed in the world, we can already start getting a taste of how a tzaddik stands in for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the tzaddik is, as the Chazal say, the avos hein hamerkava, which has a variety of different meanings. But in one level of pashtus means that the avos are the representation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Shechina in the world. They are that presence. And when a person embodies the Midah of Yesod full-heartedly, and they step aside from their local definitions and their trappings, they step into the light, and they allow themselves to rely on the Netzach Yisrael Lo Yishaker, and ultimately they can bank on the fact that they will carry through, and that they might lose the battle, but they'll ultimately will win that war, and they'll be zoche to build a bayit nachon b'Yisrael, and be zoche l'chayei olam haba. So these are some thoughts for Netzach ShebeYesod. Thanks so much again, everyone, for sharing with me for another evening. Have a wonderful night. Look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.